Thank you all very much for coming. My name's Ben Goldacre. I run the Bennett Institute, and it is with phenomenal, ecstatic pleasure that I welcome you to the inaugural professorial lecture of Professor Seb Bacon. Seb becoming a, well, yeah. Seb becoming a professor at the University of Oxford is one of those things that feels, at the same time, both highly improbable and entirely predictable. He has phenomenal technical skills. He has extraordinary strategic insight and enormous human empathy. And as a consequence of all of that, of course, has built an enormous and very happy team, many of whom are here today, and an enormous range of incredibly successful projects, products, tools, and services. And not just with us, across the whole of his life, committing himself to public service, working on better uses of government data and corporate data, as well as health data. People often wring their hands and wonder, how can we get people with software engineering skills, people who can earn enormous amounts of money in other parts of the world, to work for public sector salaries for public good on public projects? And the answer is, of course, firstly, that there are people out there who have those skills, but also have a strong sense of committed public service. That includes Seb and also many of his friends from Civic tech community who I can see out there today. But also, it's about giving people the opportunity to work on things that they know will really exist, that really will do good, that are genuinely impactful in the world. And Seb isn't just the benefactor of that working model that we've developed at the Bennett Institute. He is the originator of that working model. So, without further ado, I give you Professor Sebastian Bacon.
Thank you. Thank you. Need this. Right. Okay. Hi. I'm going to teach you how to be a scammer. First, let's imagine you're the victim, although obviously you'd never fall for it. And this is the first email you receive. It's a newsletter, free for a month, and each week it sends you one stock market tip. To prove it's worth your money, they've set you up with a pretend portfolio worth £200. The first week, their pick goes up a lot. The next week, another winner. Week after week, the newsletter calls it correctly, and your imaginary portfolio is now worth £3,000. Finally, there's an offer. Keep getting the tips for the bargain price of £500. You check, and they're not lying about the stocks. They were right. Do you subscribe? Sounds impressive, right? Let me explain how it works. There was never one newsletter. In the first week, the scammer sent hundreds of thousands of emails, each tipping a different random stock. The next week, they only emailed the people who happened to get a winning tip. And they repeated this process every week. It turns out that you were the last person standing at the end of a very long process of throwing people away. Remember the scam, because today I'm going to argue that the most important systems in our society should show they're working so we can all know what's going on. And maybe one day it might save you some money. But before I dive in, a quick apology. If you saw the first version of my invite, you might be here for a whimsical tour of tape drives, marriage bands, and leopards. It turns out I haven't got time for that. I'm afraid you're going to have to listen to me talk about what I want to, which is not leopards, but health data, for 50 minutes. Sorry. Before I do that, I want to say some quick thank yous. I am hugely honoured to be awarded the title of professor, and I feel really, really lucky to be here today. You may not know that there are different kinds of professor at Oxford. Only the traditional old school kind have to do an inaugural lecture. And I'm not that kind of professor, so I don't have to do this. Yet here I am. Why? I have been asking myself that for weeks. There were a few reasons, but the simple truth is I mostly wanted to do this for my mum and dad who are here today. Even if I just stood here for 50 minutes reading a shopping list, they'd say it was brilliant. And that unconditional support has meant so much to me for all of my life. Thanks, Mum and Dad. Thanks also to my friend Anna, who suggested I apply to work here 10 years ago, and whose work is the foundation of what I'm doing today. And thanks, of course, to Ben, who supported my late-blooming academic career right from the start, even when I initially insisted I didn't want one and I only wanted to write software. I'd like to thank my colleagues, who do most of the actual work while I'm in meetings. And thanks to my friends and family, some of whom made a huge effort to travel here. It means a lot to me. And finally, thanks to my partner, Kim, who's offered me quiet, constant support for all of my adult life. Sometimes we take our partners for granted, don't we? Well, it just happens that this lecture is about making invisible things visible. For much of my life, I've been obsessed with systems that make hidden structures visible, like X-rays, open source software, and freedom of information laws. I've come to understand that they're all expressions of the same instinct. Hidden systems concentrate power, and concentrated power is bad for society. And it's also boring. Visible systems distribute power and strengthen society, and to my mind at least, they're fun. I think I learned this instinct very early. My granddad was a signals engineer in the Second World War. He repaired cryptography machines, like this one. Although he wasn't rich, in the 1950s, he was the first person on his street to get a TV. He was obsessed with technology, and he'd worked out how to build TVs himself. By the 1980s, he had an attic full of old sets with big glass valves and bunches of dusty wires coming out the back. And I loved to see the mysterious machinery behind the glass. So it was inevitable that when home computers reached the mass market in 1981, he immediately bought one, a ZX81, which I've still got. He used to babysit me, and we'd spend hours with this strange little box plugged into a TV. You could buy games, but neither of us really cared about playing them. Grandad wanted to know how computers worked. This was a time of explosion in home computing, and there was also an explosion in cottage industry publishing. The covers were amazing. This was geeks and nerds slowly reaching out to each other and sharing what they knew in these kind of homemade magazines. The magazines came bundled with software, but this wasn't delivered on floppy disks or tape drives or CD-ROMs, but as pages of code printed in a tiny font. So we'd sit together in his living room. While he chain-smoked cigarettes, he read the code out loud, and I'd type it in. And then we'd swap. Well, I didn't smoke the cigarettes. And when we ran it, it made stuff happen on the screen. Anything from a slowly moving dot to like an interactive quiz. But what I remember most wasn't the machine, it was the ritual of figuring it out together. Before software came along, the word code meant a secret message. And that's what it was to us. Reading code aloud was strange because we didn't know what it meant. At first, it literally had no meaning to us. We already had our own secret language, so we invented another new language for the symbols. And we would spend hours babbling these made-up words at each other in order to make the software work. It was thrilling because it felt like magic. These were like runes or spells. We could invoke beings from nothing, little golems that we could have conversations with. This is a screenshot from some software called Eliza, which was first written in the 1960s, and I got to play with in the 1980s. It's strange to reflect that 30 years later, the golems we now call AI chatbots dominate the news, and the people who understand this new technology are still using secret runes, even on billboards. And this is how I slowly became a programmer. I didn't learn the information, I absorbed it. These meaningless words slowly created a form in my unconscious mind. When the internet arrived a decade later, it felt like magic all over again. I remember sitting in a university computer lab in 1995, amazed that I could control a robot arm in a lab in America to water some seeds. This time it was magic at an enormous distance. Then my friend Dave introduced me to something called Linux, and that was a huge turning point for me. Linux is an operating system. If you don't work in tech, you probably only have a vague sense of what that means. And so did I. This is what it looked like if you downloaded it, installed it, and turned your computer on. It's completely baffling. So obviously I loved it. I didn't even know Windows was an operating system because I'd never needed to. Windows simply came with computers. If you'd asked, I'd have guessed it was free. Just a necessary thing like air. When I discovered Linux, it was like finding out I'd been breathing artificial air all along. I found out there was a fresh alternative that was totally free. Linux was a complete replacement for Windows, and people were building it just for the love of it. Most importantly, the people behind it were publishing the source code. You could see inside. The people making Linux were making what was previously invisible visible. That Windows cost money, and that it was just one choice among many possible choices. And that people could build complex, wonderful, valuable, powerful things together, even when they weren't paid to. Up to that point, I hadn't even considered that I wasn't allowed to look at the source code of Windows, and now I found I could change my entire operating system and everything about how it worked. Windows had turned out to be one choice among many. And Linux turned out to be at the dawn of something now called the open source movement, and we were imagining a different world. The point I want to make, and return to later, is this. Defaults are powerful because most people barely notice them. They're not natural, they're chosen, and they can be re-chosen. So that's where I began, loving the magic of code and loving questioning anything that seems natural. But I didn't yet have a reason why this mattered to anybody but me, and it was the open source community that gave me a reason. After university, I started a company making websites for charities. It was just obvious to me that it would use and make open source software. That was my new default. I didn't think about it. I discovered that when I wanted to contribute to open source code, I had to show it to strangers in public emails and let them pick it apart. I discovered that making your work visible to strangers is a powerful quality control technique, not because people are watching constantly, but because they could watch. I also had to accept a certain amount of vulnerability to work in the open. I had to trust strangers to be kind with my work. And when I did this, they trusted me. Over time, I became part of various online communities. Strangers became friends, and it was a lot of fun. So this became my new default, working in the open, inviting people to assess my work on its merits. And I didn't really think about that either. It just happened. I didn't realize this at the time, but I was also slowly forming an instinct about speed versus accountability. There's an argument that the important thing is removing friction, moving as quickly as possible. On the other hand, there's an argument that legitimacy, accountability, and correctness matter more than speed. I loved moving quickly, I still do, but the open source movement gave me a way to balance that instinct. I'd adopted a position of working in the open, but up to this point, it was a purely personal position. It was my code, my reputation, my small corner of the internet. The thing that changed me was when I saw the same instinct turned outwards onto power. I came across a website called Fax Your MP. In 2001, most MPs had email addresses, but they didn't publish them. But they all had fax machines. So this mischievous site let you feel like you were writing an email, when in the background, it turned it into a fax and sent the fax to a politician. I was totally thrilled. Its makers were reaching out with digital tools to interact with the world like the robot arm I'd once used to water seeds in California. It was interesting and it was fun. From Fax Your MP grew a charity called My Society and a whole culture called Civic Tech, people holding power to account without taking sides and using open tools. I decided I needed to meet these people. And I met a community who treated accountability not as cynicism, not just complaining about politicians, but as a form of care. And they also became friends, some of whom are here today. When you talk to these pioneers of civic tech, they all tell you that open source seemed like the obvious default to them too. At no point was it a particularly conscious decision. My Society taught me that accountability in the public realm could be care rather than cynicism. But Fax Your MP still depended on a politician choosing to reply. There was another My Society website that completely changed how I thought about this. It made the silence itself visible. It was called What Do They Know? The Freedom of Information Act allows anyone to contact any public authority, like a hospital, a government department, or a university, and ask for any information. We all know a private, frustrating version of this. You send an email, you hear nothing, and you give up. I already had found that complaining publicly on Twitter got me far better customer service than complaining in private. The genius of What Do They Know was to apply the same principle to freedom of information requests. It publishes the email you send and the reply you get back. If they don't answer, it nudges you to ask again in public. If they do reply, the website publishes that. If they don't answer, it makes the silence visible as well. I thought this was a beautiful accountability trick, and I loved it so much I spent a couple of years working on the source code, and I've had a mild addiction to making freedom of information requests ever since. So, by the time I arrived at the Bennett Institute here in Oxford, I've been working on versions of the same problem for more than 20 years through every part of my career. Visibility is care. Visibility is the thing that forces an institution to answer instead of going quiet. The Bennett Institute is based in the Medical Sciences division here, and I had never worked on health data before I came here. But I did arrive believing very strongly that a system that you can't see into is a system that will, sooner or later, start ignoring things that don't suit it. And the health world, it turned out, was full of claims without evidence. When I arrived, I kept noticing headlines like this in the news, provided with no evidence behind them at all. £1 billion, how about that? So I tried using freedom of information requests to ask how the numbers were reached, but I had very limited success. I started wondering, what if we took the live accountability trail of What Do They Know and applied it to health data? What if we design a system that forces the evidence into the open? Not because people are bad, but because institutions drift. The idea became OpenSAFELY, which, to my surprise, ended up putting me in the middle of a debate about the future of health data management. We made OpenSAFELY to make the GP records available to researchers. GB records are the most complete account available of people's interactions with the health system from birth till death. OpenSAFELY has allowed researchers to ask and answer important questions about health using the records of 58 million people. Researchers ask these questions by writing their code, which runs against your patient data to produce their academic papers, which hopefully benefit you. OpenSAFELY does all of this without compromising patient privacy. Before OpenSAFELY, the GP profession had never trusted anyone else with all of this data because they felt there were too few safeguards in place. So we worked with them to build safeguards during the pandemic, and the platform enabled over 100 papers of COVID research. How did we earn that trust? The first way is straightforward and not particularly original. We keep the data private. In the bad old days, data like this was routinely copied onto people's laptops. This is not safe. Laptops get left on trains. So, OpenSAFELY is what some people call a code-to-data system. Instead of downloading the data from a secure vault, researchers upload their code to a secure vault. This is increasingly the standard in healthcare research, although data does still end up on laptops too often. But that's not what makes OpenSAFELY interesting, in my opinion anyway. The unique part came straight from my work on What Do They Know? When designing OpenSAFELY, it seemed obvious that if every interaction with the data were made public, it would create a trail of breadcrumbs that would be incredibly useful. There were lots of reasons we thought the breadcrumbs would be helpful. For example, a trail would help the public whose money funds research check it's happening at all. It lets researchers share expertise, but mainly, for me and us, it's an accountability trail, there to build and keep trust with the public. The big idea was a new default, a contract with researchers that says, we'll give you access to this data in a secure place, but in return, you'll publish your source code every time it touches the data. There are already campaigns to get researchers to publish their code at the end of a project. One of the most important health journals in the world, the BMJ, started requiring this a couple of years ago. But OpenSAFELY is the only platform that provides a forensic account of every decision that the researcher made in real time as they made it. Why does a complete historical trace of every interaction matter? Because if we know the full history of an analysis, we can spot bad behavior hidden in the middle of it. Sometimes this can completely flip our understanding of the result at the end. That was a lot, so let's take a quick diversion. Who agrees with this headline? Very skeptical audience, very good. Remember the stock tip scammer quietly throwing away the emails that didn't work? Researchers sometimes do a scientific version of the same thing, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. It has a name, it's p-hacking. This is Brian Wansink. He was one of the world's most famous nutrition researchers until he p-hacked. His work shaped public health messaging and generated global headlines. He ran an experiment in an Italian restaurant, convinced that people who paid more for a buffet would enjoy it more. They didn't. But instead of stopping and publishing that research, he kept trying different versions, old or young people, male or female, big groups, small groups, and so on, until he found something that let him claim, you think food tastes better if it's expensive. And the media loved it. And if you've ever wondered why the headlines are forever flip-flopping on why some food does or does not make you ill, now you know. The press rewards a good story, so some researchers keep looking till they find one. So the only way to spot p-hacking is to see every decision at every point, not just the final output. And better science is just one benefit of a complete audit trail, as you'll see. So that's why in OpenSAFELY, the full audit trail is all in public. Anyone can go to our website and understand the purpose of any project, see when the code first ran, and what happened every single time a user touched real patient data. Dates, times, who, what they did. Everything except the data itself. You can even see exactly how the code changed between one edit and the next. However, a forensic audit log is only useful if you're confident it's complete. An incomplete log could still hide things. In OpenSAFELY, the most important thing is that there is no way to interact with the data without leaving a trace. This is what is sometimes called an eyes-off model. In an eyes-on model, you might have a spreadsheet in front of you. You might sort through it. You might peek at individual records. You might take a little quiet look at your partner's medical notes. You might p-hack in private. But in an eyes-off model, the data lives somewhere you can't see it. When you write code, you hand it over to the system. The system takes your code to the data, and you get results back. The only way you can get your code into the vault is by publishing it online where the robot can access it. There's no choice. There is no other route in. So that's how we built a system that guarantees a complete audit trail, and it worked. We've got hundreds of users and hundreds of projects. They're all listed on our website. And no researcher has ever objected to their code and their activity being published automatically. Patients trusted it too. When the NHS asked a citizens' jury to discuss the data platforms that were available during the pandemic, OpenSAFELY was the only one to win unanimous support. The team even received a very large medal from the King. As you can tell, I'm very, very proud of what we've achieved. But I'm also disappointed because we haven't spread this idea more widely. So, with the rest of the time today, I want to make the case for one thing, which shouldn't surprise you, given the title of this lecture, that every use of health data should leave a public trace. In the world of health data, it sometimes feels like we're a long way from agreeing this. It can feel like there's a debate between two camps. I'm going to call them the Liberators and the stewards. The Liberators say data saves lives and bureaucratic friction is costly, so we should streamline access and trust approved institutions to behave. The stewards warn that not all rules are bureaucracy. Some rules protect a fragile social contract, and once that trust is gone, the data will go with it. And here's my position. I'm a steward and a liberator. This doesn't have to be a debate you need to take sides on. And I'm worried that if we don't take the stewards seriously, we might even put the future of the NHS at risk. Liberators feel that research is too important to be slowed by old rules built for another age. They're right. We do live in different times. But that's an argument for new rules and new technology like OpenSAFELY, not throwing old rules away. And I completely agree we shouldn't slow research down. But we don't have to choose between careful stewardship or fast research. During the pandemic, OpenSAFELY was arguably the most efficient research platform in the country. Researchers published the first paper that ever used OpenSAFELY within 7 weeks of us deciding to use the platform, build the platform. Some liberators feel that the public doesn't care about privacy, or at least not as much as the stewards claim. I find this idea very interesting, even challenging, because if it's true, I might have wasted my last 5 years on OpenSAFELY. So I recently asked friends and family how they would feel if their health data were accidentally leaked online. And about 3/4 of them said, "I've got nothing to hide." But when you ask follow-up questions, people very quickly change their position. For example, when I said, "But what about someone who's been a victim of domestic abuse?" everyone said, "Of course that matters." So, it entirely depends on the question you ask. When people say, "I've got nothing to hide," they're imagining something like a blackmailer rifling through their secrets for something embarrassing. And for most of us, there's probably nothing especially shameful in our health records. But if you dig more deeply into privacy laws and their history, it turns out that privacy isn't really about secrets. It's about power and context. Think about nakedness. Perhaps you're not particularly embarrassed by your naked body in a medical inspection. Do you want me to put a picture of your body on these slides, though? No? What about if you were naked in front of your employer? You might feel humiliation or shame. It's the same body, it's a different context. And it gets darker, because context is about power. Imagine a selfie of a girls' night out in Manchester posted on Instagram. These women consented to have their photo online. That's obviously fine. But it's clearly grotesque when they're being stalked by people making money from voyeurism. It turns out that platforms like TikTok and YouTube host thousands of what the creators euphemistically call night tours. And this isn't just ethically wrong, it has chilling effects. For example, when the BBC investigated night tours, one woman they interviewed said, "I've not been out because I'm just scared." Stalking is a specific risk with medical data. You don't worry when your GP, surgery, phones with your blood test results. But in 2019, a psychiatrist took mental health patients' data from medical records and used the data to stalk them. Again, it had a chilling effect. As the judge pointed out, this man destroyed the women's faith in the medical profession. Unfortunately, cases like this are all too common. Last month, a hospital admitted that nearly 50 staff members looked inappropriately at the medical records of victims in the Southport knife attack. In all these cases, the problem wasn't how well guarded the information was. The problem was that someone with power used their access for a purpose the individuals hadn't consented to. Stalking is always about individuals. To solve the problem of individuals being put at risk, it's sometimes argued that a process called pseudonymization fixes it. Pseudonymization is the removal of things like names and addresses from a data set before it's shared. To understand how it works, please take a moment to read this pseudonymized record of an unnamed individual. As you can see, pseudonymization doesn't really stop people being identified. And AI is making it increasingly easy to identify people even in very obscure data. But you might argue this isn't common enough to worry about that much, that these are really bad, but they're individual edge cases. It's just the odd bad apple. We should obviously work as hard as we can to prevent harm, even to tiny numbers of people. But consent isn't just about individuals. The same pattern, power plus unconsented use, also operates on entire communities, and the damage adds up over generations. A well-known case is the Havasupai tribe, whose legal rights to their huge ancestral lands around the Grand Canyon are now constrained to a small reservation. In the early 1990s, researchers from Arizona State University approached the tribe with an offer. Donate blood samples and we'll help figure out why type 2 diabetes is devastating your community. About a third of the tribe agreed. But the consent forms were written in English as a second language, and it didn't make it clear that those samples could be used for almost anything. The same blood was later used for studies on things like schizophrenia, inbreeding, and the tribe's ancient migration patterns. The migration research, for example, said that the tribe's ancestors came from Asia, which directly contradicted their cultural origin stories and the legal basis of their land claims. They didn't find out until 2003 when a tribe member happened to attend an academic presentation. The community was horrified. The tribe sued, and it became a landmark example of genetic data misuse. More importantly to them, they secured the physical return of the blood samples because DNA is not abstract data to the Havasupai. It's a sacred part of the person. The damage spread beyond the tribe. This case confirmed for indigenous communities across the US exactly what they'd feared about handing parts of themselves to outside researchers. When communities stop trusting researchers, it's similar to the chilling effect that the night tour videos have had on the behavior of women. Whole groups of people stop participating in research, and the people who most need the science benefit the least from it. This question, who gets to decide what our data is used for, matters to all of us at some point. Do you want your data to be used for creating new vaccines? Yes. Are you okay with a predatory credit company getting all of your data the minute you get bad news from the doctor? No. If we agree that privacy is more about how data is used than secrecy, then we shouldn't simply hide the data. We should preserve a complete, trustable account of how the data was used. And this is why privacy and transparency are not opposites in a system like OpenSAFELY. The data itself remains heavily protected, and what becomes visible is the use of the data. The night tours, the stalkers, and the Havasupai are all examples of the same problem. Someone with power used information for a purpose the person never agreed to. And in all of these examples, discovery of misuse depends on a journalist, or an audience member in a lecture, or a victim who happened to speak up. And in a clinical setting, we can surely do better than this. The vast majority of doctors in this country are, of course, worthy of our trust. But assuming individuals are good or relying on individuals to speak out is not a system. Nobody can maintain the tightrope walk of perfect integrity forever without some sort of external structure to support them. It's often claimed that researchers and institutions can already be trusted, so we don't need more stewardship. I agree that the vast majority of researchers and institutions can be trusted, but a public log will prove this. In fact, given the growing mistrust of experts in our bewildering world, this kind of proof seems more urgent, not less. But even when we trust researchers not to do really bad things, it's very easy to find examples where best practice isn't followed. For example, in the health data world, it is best practice to publish your code when you publish your paper for better peer review. But in reality, how much code gets shared? It's been found that no more than 1 in every 200 health papers have published their code. It's not difficult to publish your code, so why does this one simple thing not happen? I think it's because the safest and easiest thing to do with any piece of information is to keep it to yourself, unless some default system forces you to share. Every time someone decides if they will publish their code or not, it requires a tiny bit of effort. Will I get in trouble for sharing this? Or what if it makes me look stupid? That's why it was a bold move when the BMJ said that code had to be published with every paper a couple of years ago. It wasn't an easy decision for them to make, because trying to make a new default means asking some people to make risks. And the current default, baked into institutional culture, always tilts towards closing down. For example, this is a 1975 intelligence report about the future dictator Augusto Pinochet, where it turned out that they had redacted his fondness for Scotch and pisco sours. Completely unnecessary, but it's safer to hide things. I'm saying this is safety-seeking behaviour, but there's actually a whole host of other academic theories about this. There's a political theorist called Michel Crozier, for example, who's argued that in bureaucracy, control over uncertainty is the main source of power. When you share information freely, you are giving away power. So hoarding information isn't just avoiding risk. It's also a rational strategy for preserving your power. Whatever the cause for a tendency to secrecy, it seems to be increasing as the world feels more overwhelming and there are more and more decisions to make. We all know the government runs by disappearing WhatsApp messages. The reason people don't share isn't always because they're trying to hide some particular code or hide some individual WhatsApp message. It's because institutions have evolved to protect themselves in general, and no individual ever got rewarded for resisting that pull. And history shows us that institutions never voluntarily make themselves transparent. Transparency always comes from outside pressure, from people the institutions invariably think of as troublemakers. Consider Parliament. All of its debates are published, so anyone can read them. It's obvious, isn't it, that we should all be able to read what's been said in Parliament. But it's not always been that way. Before 1771, Parliament was a very secretive body. It said publishing its own debates would be a high indignity. In fact, it was illegal. Direct reporting was dangerous, so journalists used sneaky workarounds. For example, Samuel Johnson pretended he was writing about debates in the Senate of Lilliput and referred to members of the Lords and the Commons as Hergos and Clinabs. The Mayor of London had to do time in the Tower to public outrage before Parliament would let their debates be published. Nobody now thinks that Parliament was right, but at the time, the institution was just operating as it always had, assuming nobody had the authority to look. To institutions, secrecy always feels from the outside like normal. It's an invisible default. There's a political science concept that describes how troublemakers can work within systems to make them better, first described in a 1984 paper about oversight. We tend to think of oversight as a kind of constant monitoring. For example, regulators like Ofwat or the Environment Agency. They're watching water companies, for example, spotting sewage discharges into rivers, for example. The paper calls this police patrols. But constant monitoring is extremely expensive, attention drifts, and the people who are monitoring get captured by the institutions they're watching. According to this theory, what actually works is the fire alarm. You don't need someone staring at the building all the time. You need a system where, if something goes wrong, anyone can see it and pull the handle. There was a docudrama this year called Dirty Business about how the watchers can be captured by those they're watching. In this case, the Environment Agency. It's about how two ordinary people discovered illegal pollution and corporate indifference that led to poisoned rivers and beaches and avoidable deaths. It turned out that over the years, regulators have been watching the water companies less and less. This was partly, the programme argues, because senior executives had moved from the regulator to the water companies and vice versa. This capture inevitably led to lax standards and regular sewage discharge into rivers. In order to uncover this slowly unfolding disaster, these two retirees had to force data about it from the companies, one request at a time. Eventually, after years of hard campaigning, the water companies were legally obliged to publish the data, which looks like this. The raw data is hard to understand, but once you've made it available, something magical can happen. People can take that raw material and build fire alarms that are easy to use, like this website, so that anyone can sound the siren when there's a leak near them. The regulators, because they're people, can be captured. But a public fire alarm is a system. There's literally no one to capture. Water companies and health data research might seem like an odd pairing. Both involve information the public has a stake in, and neither has much incentive to share it. At least, not until change is forced from the outside and a new default begins to take hold. So the audit trail in OpenSAFELY isn't there to allow constant police patrols. Research without a public trail is like a building without a fire alarm. Behaviour drifts from best practice gradually, the way it did with water companies. First, you get used to the smell of burning toast. Then you stop noticing smoke at all. And then one day, you have a big problem. A guaranteed open activity log would prevent that drift. P-hacking and stalking would still be possible, but they'd have to be carried out in public with a very real chance of being found out. I want to see a world where a public audit trail guaranteed by eyes-off technology is required for every interaction with our private health data. We've shown it can be done, and we've shown it doesn't have to be slow. We can be both liberators and stewards at the same time. But what seems obvious to me is not obvious to everyone. The OpenSAFELY service is the only system we know of to have installed a public fire alarm, and the untraceable eyes-on method remains the invisible default. Why? Well, it can't be because it's hard to build, because we built the first version in 7 weeks. Quite often, we hear that it's hard to use, but the idea that it's hard to use comes almost entirely from people who've never used it. I do understand the discomfort, though. I think it's an important point. At first, if you're forced to plan up front, which is what an eyes-off system does, instead of intuitively playing with the data, it can feel like trying to eat an apple without using your hands. It's a different way of working. There's a cost to learning that. But people who have used the system often tell us the benefits outweigh the cost. For example, every idea they've ever had about the data has been recorded, and they like that because it lets them revisit their own reasoning. But in any case, plenty of things we rightly value are inconvenient, like insisting police interviews be recorded, or having election observers at vote counts. The question is if this effort is doing anything useful. Here, I claim it plainly is, because hundreds of people have used the system successfully to produce high-impact work with very high levels of public trust. Research using NHS data has saved lives. And I understand the frustration of brilliant people who believe they could save more lives. And I trust every researcher I've ever worked with. But trust is not a system. Trust doesn't scale. Trust is mortal and fragile. The doctor you liked retires. The researcher you believed in moves on to a sickeningly well-paid job at Google. But the structures they worked inside, built to hoard information or bury an inconvenient finding, they live on. They're practically immortal. So when someone says, just trust us, they're asking mortals to hold their ground against something that will outlast everyone who built it. And it's an unfair fight. The mortals will lose. And by fixing our attention on people, just trust us lets the structures slip out of sight. We've changed invisible defaults before. Windows wasn't a natural phenomenon. Parliament's secrecy wasn't sacred. The water company's silence wasn't inevitable. Each one looked permanent until a few troublemakers made the choice visible. I'm asking for a shift in the current invisible default so that accountability has the chance of becoming a system that will last a long time, a system that's in balance with the systems that have evolved to pull it in the other direction. I want accountability to become so normal it's invisible. We need to build systems that technically require accountability, not assume it. Systems where the audit trail exists before it needs to be read, and systems where the fire alarm is installed before the fire. We've learned in other domains that we shouldn't trust ourselves with power. It's something science discovered with peer review of scientific papers. That seems normal now, but Einstein hated it. It's something that liberal democracy relearns every time a court overrules a minister and in the slow counting of papers from the ballot box. We shouldn't trust ourselves with power. Not because we're bad people, because we're fallible, because the path of least resistance for any institution with unconstrained authority leads somewhere we don't want to go. Civilization advances, I think, when skepticism becomes infrastructure, when we stop relying on the virtue of individuals and start building systems that guarantee accountability. And I don't think this skepticism is a cynical view of the world. In fact, it might be the most hopeful one. When I agree to be held accountable to you, I'm trusting you with real power over me. And when I show that I'm trusting you, you're more likely to trust me with power over you. And when enough of us do this, we create a community of people who've made themselves vulnerable to each other. For me, that's what community means. That's what the open source community gave me at the start of my career. And that ultimately is what the NHS was built on. Not simply the pooling of resources, but the pooling of vulnerability. The belief that our lives are safer and more meaningful when we agree to care for each other through institutions strong enough to outlast any one of us. But social contracts like this only survive when people believe they're being kept. The OpenSAFELY website lists every piece of research ever done on the GP records of the nation at scale. Every project, every researcher, every line of code, every change. Most of it will never be looked at, but it could be by a journalist, a regulator, a patient, anyone. That possibility is the point. Somewhere in that list is a study that will change how a disease is treated forever. The patients whose data was used will never know. The researcher who wrote the study code will never meet them. But the social contract between them, that the data was used carefully for the purpose that was given, is legible, is there in the public trace. That's not surveillance. That's how a community keeps its promises to itself. Thank you.